This is an oral evidence session of the Foreign and the Foreign and Commonwealth Select Committee, and it's a one-off session on the situation in Eastern DRC. And we're very grateful to have some witnesses who are going to help us with what has been happening in DRC recently. I wondered if you might introduce yourself, please. Can I start with you, Richard? Yeah.
Do I need to press anything? No.
Okay. No, just talk.
So I'm Richard Moncrief, and I'm the Great Lakes Director at International Crisis Group. We're a research and advocacy NGO.
I'm Michaela Wrong. I'm a journalist and a book writer, and I've written two books, one on Mobutu Sese Seko, the president of Zaire, and most recently Do Not Disturb, which focuses on the current Rwanda regime. And I'm a freelancer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving us your time today. I know that this is an issue of great interest to many people, so I think that it's very timely. I wondered, though, for people who don't know much about the situation in DRC, if Richard, if you wouldn't mind perhaps beginning with explaining the background to the conflict in Eastern DRC, and kind of what has happened and how does it tie in with previous conflicts. And who are the parties? If you wouldn't mind, just give us an overview so that we know what it is that we're dealing with.
Sure. Well, the current conflict in DRC started in late 2021 with the emergence of the M23 insurgents group, which attacked a small outpost of the Congolese government in November of that year in the Virunga National Park in North Kivu province.
That's not the first time we've heard of them. They've been around before, right?
There's certainly background that goes back before 2021. So if you want me to go through that, the M23 is the latest iteration of a number of principally Tutsi-dominated armed insurgencies backed by Rwanda. There have been others backed by Uganda, but there have been those backed by Rwanda. They go back to the 1990s civil war, when one such insurgency held a large amount of DRC territory in the middle of the civil and regional war, which was ended in the 2002-2003 peace agreements. Following that, there was another insurgency known as the CNDP insurgency, in which a number of previous rebel leaders backed by Rwanda, but who had been integrated into the National Congolese Army, rebelled from the army, created a new insurgency, and that ended with negotiation and in the end dispersed, and the leader of that rebellion was put in house arrest in Kigali in Rwanda. Then in 2012 and 2013 the M23 re-emerged again with Rwandan backing. They took over fairly large areas of North Kivu, though not on the scale that they have currently, and they very briefly took over the city of Goma for around about 10 days. That period of war at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, was brought to an end by a combination of a special forces operation within the UN largely by South African but other southern African countries against the M23. And at the same time, there was considerable diplomatic pressure, including from the UK government, on Kigali to withdraw its support for the M23. The M23 then were pulled back and went back to their bases or refugee camps or camps in Uganda and in Rwanda, and that brought a close to that period in 2013. There was a broad Great Lakes Peace and Stability Agreement that was signed at the end of 2013. It wasn't particularly well implemented, but at least there was a pause in that kind of fighting for that period. Then, as I said, in 2021, the M23 re-emerged at a time of increasing rivalry over territorial control in Eastern DRC between Rwanda and Uganda, which I believe was at the origins of the emergence of the M23. In other words, that Rwanda reactivated the M23 in order to place its chess pieces against the Ugandans, who were coming in and building roads and getting a much bigger footprint in Eastern DRC and Ituri and North Kivu provinces. So I could take the story up from November 2021.
And I think also, just again, for people who are coming to this cold, why would there be a Tutsi group established in this particular part next to Rwanda? It's because also after the civil war in Rwanda, after the genocide, there were Hutus moving into this eastern part of DRC too, weren't there? Who were leaders of the other side. Is that right?
Well, there was evidently the genocide in 1994 in Rwanda, which drew lines between Hutus and Tutsis, and those lines spilled over into DR Congo.
Yes.
But I don't think that explains what's happening at the moment, because I think that what's happening at the moment is a strategic move by Rwanda that is not necessarily about countering Hutus, but I guess we'll come on to the reasoning and the justification of Rwanda's position later, perhaps.
Okay.
Or I could now, but as you wish.
I think you might as well tell us now. So just so that we could, because we're just trying to kind of understand the background to it. Again, if I was a member of the public listening to this, I think, why is all this going on? So it's so I think it is probably quite important to kind of understand the dynamics as well.
Sure. So the Rwandans, I think I have to go back to 2021 a little bit. The Rwandans supported the M23 and have done throughout the period from November 2021 until now. For at least the first few years, and arguably today, they've denied that they support the M23. It's arguable whether they really deny it at the moment, but in any case, they have some creative ambiguity over that. However, in conversations about Eastern DRC, Rwandan leadership, and you can look, for example, at statements of the UN Security Council or interviews from the President of Rwanda, they evoke two key related issues which appeared to justify what they call defensive measures, or would eventually justify their support for the M23, which they don't admit to, but they still give justificatory elements to. And those are the supposed persecution of Tutsis within Eastern DRC. That's one. And then the other is the presence and threat posed by the FDLR, which is a Hutu group, some of whose leadership were involved in the genocide in 1994, although demographics being what it is, that's a reducing number, evidently, it now being over 30 years since that genocide. So those are the elements that Rwanda puts across. However, when we look at what Rwanda are doing, I think that I would make two key observations. One is that by supporting an insurgency in North Kivu, Rwanda is worsening some of the problems that it's purporting to solve, and in particular the position of Congolese Tutsis, which is worsened by the actions of the M23. So it's difficult to square what the Rwandan leadership says with what they do. Now, if you also take what's happened since the beginning of this year, which is the very rapid expansion of the footprint of the M23, and in fact we'll come on to that with the current situation, that doesn't match in any way I can see an attempt to protect Congolese Tutsis. The actions don't match what they say.
You talked about Uganda.
Yeah.
And again, so what's Uganda doing here?
So Uganda has been involved in a military operation to the north of the M23 area in Ituri province for a number of years, since I believe the beginning of 2021, but I have to confirm the exact date. And that has been authorised with the Kinshasa government in cooperation with the Congolese army, and reportedly in quite good cooperation, acting against the ADF Islamist insurgents who are of Ugandan origin. I know there's a lot of spaghetti soup, but I'm just trying to walk it through. And so the Ugandans have been present in Ituri province. There is a question, which is, have the Ugandans supported the re-emergence of the M23? The Rwandans have claimed several times that the M23 in its current form is a product of Ugandan support, and the evidence they present for that is that the leadership, the main current leadership of the M23, was in exile in Uganda, not in Rwanda, since 2013. The evidence, as I've been able to gather myself, and Crisis Group has, and also other organisations such as the UN expert panel, would indicate that the Ugandan position is somewhat ambivalent. They have given small-scale support to the M23, possibly allowing free passage in our territory and allowing them to recruit in refugee camps in Uganda. But that is does not by any means explain the emergence of the M23, and there's no evidence to say that Uganda is behind the M23 in any meaningful way at the moment.
I think, again, perhaps another important bit of background, again, if you were coming to this cold, I mean, it's perhaps, it's difficult that there might be anyone who doesn't appreciate just how difficult life is in DRC and how little control the government has over this huge country with so little infrastructure. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, and the situation in the east in particular is very, very bad and has got very much worse since 2021. And one of the great worries of the current situation is that it is essentially overturning 20 years of dedicated and extremely expensive, including by the UK taxpayer, peace building in eastern DR Congo, including through an expensive UN mission, but also through direct bilateral aid to DR Congo. And the fear, I think, is that the current situation is going to set that right back and effectively kind of, take it back to zero, as it were, where all the effort over the last 20 years is wiped out.
And Eastern DRC is, just such a long way away from the capital, right? Like from London to Moscow, kind of levels of. That's how vast the country is, right?
That's true, but I would just emphasise that people feel Congolese, and there is a very strong sense of Congolese nationalism and a very strong sense of Congolese identity. And when you're in Goma or you're in North Kivu, there's no mistake where you are. You're in the Congo. Now, many people there feel somewhat neglected by Kinshasa. That's certainly true.
And you couldn't drive to Kinshasa exactly very easily. There's not a kind of road network that you'd recognise.
No, it's one of the great problems that DR Congo faces. Absolutely, there's very, very weak national infrastructure.
Right. Okay. Good. I hope you don't mind my just taking you through the basics, but we need to make sure people watching can kind of come with us in this evidence. I wondered, could I perhaps turn to you, Michaela? How has the M23 managed to capture Goma so quickly and so much of the area so quickly? What has changed since 2012? Why is it that they've been able to get such a large amount of land? Because in 2012 they tried to capture the city, but it was nothing like as successful as it is now.
Well, I think it's very pertinent to this meeting that what we saw in 2012, after they went into Goma, was there was a major reaction from the international community, where really the bilateral donors to Rwanda, who provide a very important part of their government budget every year, formed a united front and condemned what was going on and there was no hesitation about them making the link between the M23 and Rwanda. And they cut aid, and part of the aid cut was also a World Bank funding cut. And effectively that meant that Rwanda could not afford to continue to support the M23 because it saw a direct impact on its budget, its health budget, its education budget. Rwanda is a heavily aid-dependent country. Sometimes up to 70% of its government operating budget is provided by the West. So it responded to that fairly promptly, and miraculously this what was being presented as a local rebel movement, representing the interests of the protecting the Congolese Tutsi community, suddenly dispersed, and as Richard said, went back to Uganda and Rwanda. So I think that was one element in why the problem appeared to disappear in 2012 very rapidly.
Are you implying that if the same thing happened again?
Yes, I'm being one of the journalists and analysts who've been saying, we know this works. We should be doing the same thing. And in my view, we've missed that boat, but we can still, apply pressure that will be effective, because I think Rwanda has shown in the past that it responds very promptly to that kind of pressure. It's acutely aware of that kind of pressure. But just to go back to one of the reasons why the Congolese army, what you have is an extraordinary combination of forces trying to protect Congolese national territory and enforce the border. And there's, the Congo army. There are sprays of local militias, which are communally known as the Wazalendo. You've also had 2 regional African peacekeeping forces, first an East African one, which was replaced by a South African-led one, which has just announced its withdrawing.
Why is it, and again, just for the record, why is it announced it's withdrawing?
Because it was surrounded by the M23 and forced to put down its weapons and took 14 casualties and couldn't even get the bodies of its dead peacekeepers out. Such was the hold of the M23 on that area.
And there's also UN peacekeepers.
I was going to come to that. Yeah. There's MONUSCO, which is one of the longest-running UN peacekeeping operations in history, has been there. They also seem to be, they're just sitting in Goma now, taking in Congolese army soldiers who are surrendering. So you have an extraordinary combination of forces. One of the reasons why they're all there, you also have the Burundian army has been active in the area. They had at one stage 10,000 to 12,000 troops in Congo with the blessing of the Congolese government. And one of the reasons that all of these forces have been called in to help protect this frontier is because the Congo army is notoriously ill-disciplined, underfunded, badly trained, and demoralized. And they have really been showing that they are incapable of protecting national territory. There was one group I forgot to mention in that summary, which is that the Congolese government hired several groups of white mercenaries, military contractors, 2 separate companies. So I think it's, firstly, that situation illuminates quite how incapable of Congo is of protecting its own borders, and that's a problem that goes back to the Mobutu era and the many previous regimes. But it also highlights the efficiency and armory and sophistication of the force they have been fighting, which is, the M23 backed up by Rwanda with some very sophisticated weaponry. We're talking about surface-to-air missiles. We're talking about GPS systems, drone blocking systems. We're talking about. I'm not a defence specialist, but if you read the last UN group of experts reports in December, they go into the detail of what armory the Rwandan army has at its disposal and how it's being used to support the M23. And we have to sort of stress that the M23 is not just, there in a puppet capacity, a sort of, doing the bidding of Rwanda. Rwanda has, by some estimates, between 8 or 12,000 troops who are actually on Congolese land, on Congolese territory, fighting alongside the M23. So it's often, when you talk to people and you say where, troops rolled into the city, where they M23 or where they Rwandan forces, people will say, we can't tell the difference. They've got the same weapons, they've got the same uniforms, they behave in the same way. They are behaving in many cases like a regular army, not like some sort of disorganized ragtag rebel movements. And as a journalist, I've spent a long time covering ragtag rebel movements in Africa. And if you just look at the pictures of the M23, because they're much photographed now, they look like an army, they don't look like a rebel group.
How do those numbers compare with the estimates of M23 numbers?
I'm afraid I don't know what estimates the M23 have been giving. Rwanda has been denying that it has any forces inside Congo at all. When you say the numbers, you mean which numbers?
If you're saying that there's potentially 12,000 Rwandan troops, I'm wondering if that is...
Well, I don't think the M23 would ever confirm that, because Rwanda's position is it has no troops inside Congo.
What I'm wondering is what the size of the M23 is.
Okay, sorry. Richard, you may know better than me on this one. I think it's the Rwandan army now outstrips the M23 quite considerably, doesn't it?
So I was in Goma last year and talked to some very well-informed sources. and they estimated in line with but a little bit above the estimate of the UN experts, which was around 3,000 combatants on the side of the M23, but more from Rwanda, and that's at the middle of 2024. The consensus view, which I agree with and I think matches the evidence, is that Rwanda significantly increased the number of troops at the end of 2023 in the context of an offensive that the DRC government was making against the M23. So the numbers went up, the number of Rwandan troops went up at the end of 2023. If we look at the UN expert report from December, which the evidence is finalised in November, we're already quite a bit out of date with that. I mean, I think that...
Is it right that the UN group of experts on DRC said that Rwandan defence forces had, quote, de facto control and direction over M23 operations, which renders Rwanda liable for the actions of M23?
I consider that to be completely right.
Okay. I'm sorry, I got cut across.
And something worth mentioning on the numbers of the M23 is that as the M23 extends its area of control, because it's still on the move and it's still capturing territory, what's happening is you're seeing Wazalendo, which is the local militias, are quite rightly seeing the way things are moving and the momentum behind this force, and are either throwing down their weapons or joining the M23. So the numbers are changing because it's becoming a bigger force.
If I could just add a little trailer to that, just to agree with that. So we know for sure that the M23 has been recruiting captured soldiers in Wazalendo to try to swell its own ranks. Not sure that's going to be a quick process. You can't necessarily control these people on your own side. But I would just like to make a point, which is for the last few years, there's been a kind of debate of does Rwanda support the M23 and so forth. It seems to me that events have overtaken that debate considerably. Rwanda has simply invaded eastern DRC. Absolutely all the evidence points to it very, very clearly. The M23 is a tool and a leverage in the hands of Kigali. As individuals, they have their own agenda. They may seek amnesty, they may seek integration into the army. But just to be completely clear, we would not be in this situation without Rwandan initiative. Michaela's mentioned the equipment that the Rwandans have used. Surface-to-air missiles and jamming equipment has been absolutely critical because it's completely grounded the entire, not significantly large, but nevertheless strategically important Congolese Air Force, including attack drones, and gave the M23 basically a clear run into Goma. So I just think we need to be quite clear where we're at, because we are now in a situation where we're not just looking at the M23 nibbling at some corners of North Kivu, we're looking at potentially Rwanda taking a great big chunk out of a very unstable country.
And what are their war aims? I mean, you any idea? I mean, are they going to stay in eastern DRC, or are they heading for Kinshasa?
Can I make a point? I wrote about this for Foreign Affairs recently. I think there's an open question about Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president's war aims. You know, what will he be satisfied with? But we have to sort of look at it in a historical context. And this is the man who in 1997 supported a rebel group, which also had a strong Tutsi component to it, which marched all the way to Kinshasa and overturned the regime of President Mobutu Sese Seko. He then, a year later, attempted to do the same thing to the rebel leader he had put in position, Laurent Kabila. He failed in that attempt. But this is actually the fifth time in which Rwanda has intervened, backing a rebel movement inside Congo. Paul Kagame has form. And what I noticed, and many analysts noticed, about 2023 is you started to hear a discussion, and this was started by Paul Kagame himself when he was on a visit to Benin, of the fact that the Tutsi kingdom, which is a pre-colonial entity that used to exist, used to be, according to Paul Kagame, it used to comprise a bigger area than the current Rwandan state. and that by rights it extended into Uganda and Congo, and I believe Burundi as well. And colonialism had sort of forced upon Rwanda a smaller area than its pre-colonial entity. And I think a lot of people looked at that and thought, is this a kind of preparation for what he's trying to do again? So that would suggest a kind of Kivu protectorate, which would be presumably controlled or take directions from Kigali. But there is also, as I mentioned, this track record of attempts which have been successful at least once to overturn the leadership of the president in Kinshasa. So I think the question is, how far will he go? And I think that one of the problems is the international community has allowed these ambitions to become bigger and bigger because there hasn't been a real brake applied.
Do you have any follow-up questions at this stage, John?
I think a lot of it has been covered, but I just wanted to probe a little bit. You're very clear that the M23 are basically being controlled and in large part backed by Rwanda. How does the DRC government view it? Do they consider themselves to be essentially in a state of war with Rwanda?
Absolutely. And the position of the DRC government has been very clear for a number of years that our country may have many problems, but the specific problem we're talking about here is an act of international aggression. That's absolutely clear in the mind of Kinshasa and has been since the second half of 2022.
You said Burundi, who was also supplying troops into the eastern region, DRC, in support of the DRC government. So, is this likely to become a Rwanda-Burundi conflict as well?
It already has been, so that a large number of the main clashes and the main deadly clashes since the beginning of this year were actually between Rwandan and Burundi troops on Congolese soil. We know historically that countries of the Great Lakes tend to fight in DR Congo. It seems to be easier than doing it on their own border, so that's happened in the past. We already have that. Now, just for information, the Burundi government, presumably sensing which way the wind was blowing, has in the last 10 days, I think is about right, has started to make much noises of opening towards Kigali and is clearly trying to soften its approach towards Kigali, I think because the government in Burundi felt that it was actually under direct threat from the Rwandans. It's a very poor, very fragile government. Putting troops into the Congo was already very controversial. They were not, the Burundian government weren't transparent about how many were in there, how many were dying. This was very secretive in military hospitals in Burundi about how they were getting paid. So Burundi put a lot of troops on the side of DR Congo. They really put their eggs in that basket. They were undoubtedly well paid for doing so by Kinshasa. But in the last few weeks, when it has become clear that the DR Congo army has been routed in Goma and was unable to defend Bukavu, Bukavu being towards Burundi from Goma, going towards Burundi, the Burundi government realised that it needed to rebalance its eggs and put some in the Kigali basket to avoid a conflagration potentially on its border with Rwanda.
And can I just ask you, you outlined earlier the reasons that have been given by Rwanda, concern about their own security and territorial integrity, and also the perpetrators of the genocide are over the border in eastern part of DRC. Do you, either of you, see any legitimacy in these arguments?
So I think that the discourse of Rwanda that they are under threat from Hutu-based organisations who are anti-Tutsi based in DR Congo, there is a reality to that. Those groups exist. Now, there was a diplomatic process before 2021 which sought to address this, and I just highlight that Rwandan special forces were in DR Congo in 2019 and 20, during which time they actually killed the historic leader of the FDLR, which is the Hutu group that is the threat to Rwanda that Rwanda often evokes. So those threats exist. They could be dealt with through diplomacy and have been dealt with through diplomacy in the past and could be contained. That's been proven. Those threats, to some degree, and particularly the issue of the Tutsis in the Congos, have been made worse by what Rwanda has done, and therefore it's difficult to understand their justifications. And then I think we have to also take into account that in the last 3 months, I think in a way that whole narrative has just been completely overtaken. The areas that the M23 are pushing into in South Kivu and now west on the axis towards Kisangani, those are not areas where Tutsis have been persecuted. In fact, there is not adequate evidence that Tutsis have been persecuted in DR Congo. If there was, I'm sure the Rwandan government would supply it, but we haven't had that. It doesn't match events on the ground at all.
Can I just add? I mean, when I was first writing about the M23, the return of the M23 a couple of years ago, I kept asking my analyst friends how many FDLR are in Eastern Congo. And they routinely were saying to me between 600 and 1,000 fighters. You're talking about the Rwandan army is one of the most impressive armies in sub-Saharan Africa. It's been extremely well equipped. It's extremely well trained, partly because they send their fighters to places like Sandhurst and Fort Leavenworth to be trained. They know exactly what they're doing. They've got the latest equipment. I find it hard to believe that they weren't able to deal with 600 or 1,000 ragtag, and those really were ragtag, aging former members of the extremist Hutu groups. The other thing is, Rwanda is a source of peacekeepers for Africa around the continent. The army is regarded as being so impressive, so disciplined, so well run that they are sent to Central African Republic, Mozambique. They're often they've been to Darfur, South Sudan. They're probably going to deploy in Western Africa increasingly. And the idea, Kagame uses the phrase existential threat about the FDLR, and you kind of go, you're representing these people as an existential threat. You are sending your incredibly impressive army all around Africa to play the role of peacekeepers. This picture just doesn't add up.
If I could just add a very quick ride on that, with your permission. The support that the Rwandans are given to the M23 is started in the beginning of 2022, and I'm quite sure of that. I know the evidence is compelling in my view. Some of the things which the Rwandan government uses to justify its position, such as the growing alliance in its eyes between the Congolese army and the FDLR, also a very hostile rhetoric on the part of Congolese politicians to the Rwandan government. That was particularly true around the elections in the Congo in 2023. All those things came after Rwanda had taken a strategic decision to support the M23.
I think actually we're going to move around the way we were going to ask some questions, because I think given where we're going with the evidence, I think it's probably best to go to Afra and then to Ed, if that's all right.
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the information so far. There have been a number of warnings about how the kind of escalating crisis might trigger a wider regional conflict. How seriously do you think we should take these warnings? Rich, do you want to, or McKenna?
Well, I mean, I think they already are affecting the region, because we've already mentioned Uganda has got between 5,000 and 6,000 troops inside Congo. It's not clear. I think my impression is that Uganda's hovering on the brink of a more muscular intervention. In the past, Uganda and Rwanda have often intervened in Congo in tandem, but sort of carving out their separate areas of control, and it's possible that we might see a repeat of that. Burundi clearly feels it is directly in line of fire and is responding to that. So we've already got, spreading destabilization in the Great Lakes, and it's created massive movements of people. And, we can come to that later, but, nobody knows what's happened to up to 800,000 people who are living in displaced camps in Goma, and those camps were systematically destroyed by the M23. So we're seeing a sort of radiating instability in the region.
Richard, would you agree with that? And I mean, do you think it could even spread wider than Burundi and Uganda?
I think I would just nuance it a little bit in the sense that since the fighting in the course of late January and early February, the countries which had deployed troops on the side of Kinshasa, which is southern African countries plus Burundi, have actually withdrawn their support for Kinshasa. And the Southern Africans are now licking their wounds and have very recently decided that they have to bow to the inevitable and bow to reality, which is that they're not going back into the Congo anytime soon. So at a certain level, that
again, I mean, we're told that there were 13 South African soldiers who were killed, that there was increased tension, that the South Africans warned against further attacks and said it would be a declaration of war, that Paul Kagame said, well, if South Africa wants confrontation, Rwanda will deal with the matter in that context any day. So it sounded like there was a bit of squaring up, but you're saying that now the South Africans...
The South Africans
right.
have blinked and said, we're pulling out. Okay. They want a phased withdrawal. They want to be able to remove their military equipment, which is a very considerable part of their own weaponry, but they are pulling out of there.
But I think that we have to, if we look further ahead, we have to, in order to understand where regional politics is going to go, there's a few things to take into account. One is that Kinshasa has been cornered into talking to the M23. That is something that Kinshasa did not want to do. And the final brick in the dam, if that's the right analogy, came when the Angolans turned their position and told Kinshasa that they had to talk to the M23. Now that's an Angolan reading of the rapport de force. In other words, the Angolans are looking at the situation, they're looking at the M23 taking over more and more territory in eastern DRC, they're going to their Kinshasa counterparts, their Congolese counterparts, and saying, you've got to talk to these guys. It's a little bit against the Angolan take, because the Angolans have been leading an international mediation effort which was aimed at getting Rwanda to talk to the Congolese and not the M23 up until very recently. So there's a little bit of the pieces on the chessboard are moving a little bit in that sense. But this is very dangerous territory because the Tshisekedi and his government have really attached their flag to the mast of anti-Rwanda and anti-M23 sentiment, which is very widely held in DR Congo. It was a mainstay of the election campaign in 2023, and it remains a popular position taken by Tshisekedi and by his allies. If, on the back of their strength, which could still be expanded, it would be, I would expect the M23 to further expand their territory as they talk, because that's what they've done in the past. So even as talking, they will probably take more ground in order to put pressure on Kinshasa in talks in Angola. If that happens, and the M23 continue to push for more and more concessions, which could involve a seat in a government. I mean, they already control a very large, bite of the territory, and they could control more. They have the capacity to do so. Then I think we're looking at a significant undermining of the legitimate government of DR Congo in Kinshasa, and then the regional politics will come back in if we see that, because we could anticipate Angola, as it has done in the past, coming back in on the side of Kinshasa effectively to defend a government against a widening invasive force. Just to underline as well that, of course, as we would expect, the opponents to Tshisekedi, including the previous president, President Kabila, who has no love lost with his successor, or at least Kabila is lining up, at least publicly, is indicating his support for the M23. Kabila, who is usually very silent, recently published an op-ed in a South African newspaper. And I mean, if you get the context and you read it, you basically read he's supporting the M23. That's very dangerous. Kabila has networks in the army, he has a lot of money, he has a lot of influence in DR Congo and in the region. So to sum up what I'm saying is that at the moment you see a strategic pause regionally as the M23 and Rwandans push into DR Congo. However, as this becomes more and more of a threat to the actual stability of DR Congo as a whole, and I would anticipate that it will, then you could see regional powers coming back in on different sides of the chessboard.
With the aim of actually, I mean, people like Uganda, Burundi, and Angola, are they just going to go in and make a land grab?
I would not anticipate that approach from Angola. Angola has no particular incentive to do that. Angola has been historically supportive of governments in Kinshasa. Just for background, since 2022, Angola has been leading I would argue, quite honourable but very difficult attempt to mediate between Kinshasa and Kigali, which ran aground in December and has now fully run aground. So I wouldn't anticipate that from Angola, but one could envisage a scenario where the Angolans are defending a government in Kinshasa against an advancing M23. Just to be clear, the M23 has a political umbrella, the Congo River Alliance, whose stated objective is to overthrow President Tshisekedi, and whose strategic objective is to, rather like a snowball, to stick to it, my word's not very good, other opponents, either armed or not armed, and create a snowball effect to eventually unseat the government in Kinshasa. And they're quite open about that. That's not hidden at all.
Given the uncertainty and the several moving pieces that you've talked about, what role, if any, do you think the UK should be playing in trying to stop this wider regional escalation, or as part of the mediation that's going on?
Well, I think that the UK needs to talk to its allies in Kigali and say, stop, this is enough. What you are doing is going to upset it's highly destructive for the Congo, which is a very fragile country. You will not be able to control the outcome. It is destroying years and years of the work and expense that governments like the UK has put in, and you need to stop this and start to consider seriously de-escalation measures, and that needs to come with pressure, and it needs to come in a coordinated manner.
I think one of the problems with the UK is under the previous government, obviously we had the asylum project, which was disastrous as far as the situation is concerned. Its impact was enormous because essentially Rwanda was promised a huge amount of aid that it wasn't due to receive up front. It just went into a different form. I think they received over 250 million in the end. But the cut to the British aid programme meant that they weren't due to receive anything like the sum they ended up receiving, and it basically meant that for the years in which that asylum project was being debated and challenged and taken through the courts here, not a single British official, not a single British diplomat, nobody connected with Britain would express a view on what was happening in Congo and the very obvious support that the Rwandans were giving to the M23. So effectively, Rwanda bought Britain's silence on that issue. And Rwanda has done other deals, of this kind with France. France has a lot of interest that are being protected by Rwanda. America tended to see Rwanda as, keeping Islamic jihadism at bay and various African hotspots. So there were sort of a range of interests that meant that no one wanted to stand up and say to Paul Kagame, stop what you're doing. More recently, we saw David Lammy's announcement, which I thought was great and very welcome. But every single one of the measures that was announced is open to interpretation. For example, when he talks about cutting aid, there's a sort of weasel phrase of review, to all but the most vulnerable Rwandans, that aid to those will be exempt and guaranteed. Well, most Rwandans outside the elite are vulnerable, and I understand that was an indication that a rural poverty program that the Brits run will be exempt from aid cuts. Well, what about the poor and the vulnerable in Eastern Congo, who are in far, far worse straits than the poor of Rwanda? It's a very strange priority to maintain. And if you look at all the measures that David Lammy announced, every single one of them could be enforced in a very impressive way that would really have a major impact, in my view, but they could also just sort of go by the board. I think basically the current government wasted a lot of time. There was a period after, as soon as Keir Starmer came in, the asylum project was scrapped, much to the relief of all the people who thought it was actually illegal, apart from being also morally questionable. But then there was a 6-month period in which Britain did not take a view on what was happening in Eastern Congo and Rwanda's very increasingly obvious support. At that time, the Americans were coming out and giving very, very explicit condemnations of both what the M23 was doing and Rwanda's support for the M23, and the fact that Rwanda had troops inside Eastern Congo, and it was obvious to everybody that they did. But the Brits were largely silent. So I think there's a lot of catching up to do. I think Britain has been amongst many Western governments that have emboldened and encouraged Kagame to feel that he can get away with anything. And I think if you look at his politics, what Kagame does is he'll do something and he'll wait to see if there's a reaction. He's acutely sensitive to Western responses. And he'll wait, see, nothing happens, nobody says anything, and then he'll push again, and then he pushes again, then he pushes again. Just earlier today, I don't know if the committee's followed it, but a couple of hours ago, Rwanda, the EU announced sanctions against 9 Rwandan and M23, Rwandan defense forces, and also the M23 leader of the M23 and their head of propaganda, and also a gold mine, a gold processing plant inside Rwanda. What's very interesting is to see the immediate response of the Rwandans, which has been to expel Belgian diplomats and sever all diplomatic relations because apparently they blame the Belgians for what the EU has finally announced. Rwanda responds with lightning speed to any attempt to put pressure on it because it really minds and it knows that those kind of initiatives have an impact. So I think, it's always worth doing things because this is not a government that is immune to pressure, quite the opposite.
We need to get into the role of minerals. I mean, if you're talking about DRC, you've got to talk about minerals. But I wondered, I don't know whether you want to start with the later questions you were going to ask first, since it follows on, and then go back to minerals.
I mean, I had a sort of general question. I mean, it's 80 years since the various international apparatus that are supposed to prevent atrocities and punish them were established. But for much of the last 30 odd years, the Great Lakes region has been a kind of byword for a failure of those institutions. What could have been done better to prevent what's happening at the moment at a sort of multilateral level, to prevent the atrocities that we've seen?
You're not talking in reference to the minerals. No.
I think we'll come on to minerals.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
In terms
I'm just trying to keep us kind of. All right. We've got a series of questions in a particular order, but actually, given the way the evidence is coming, I'm shuffling it around, which is perhaps making it more chaotic than needs to be. I'm just trying.
What could have been done internationally to prevent the current
the atrocities we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I think there's I think there's been a misreading of of what Rwanda is for many years, and we saw this during the whole debate over the asylum process, that Rwanda is routinely being presented as a safe a model of development, a safe place, a clean place, a well-ordered place. And it's as though what it's doing inside Congo is completely separate and not being done by the same government. This is a government that runs a very tight ship on its own soil, partly because it's a police state, it's an authoritarian state, and that's what they do. But it's also a government that intervenes with absolute impunity and has been doing so now for 30 years and has been destabilizing systematically its much larger and much more resource-rich neighboring country. And yet, which is the country that has been repeatedly benefiting from aid, from the admiration of development officials around the world, from the fact that the Commonwealth chose to stay Chogam in Kigali a couple of years ago, from the fact that it was allowed to enter, to join the Commonwealth without meeting any of the criteria that are stipulated by the Commonwealth's charter, founding charter, the fact that we're seeing, endless sports organisations staging their glossy events and accepting the sponsorship of one of the poorest countries in the world is sponsoring Arsenal football team, Paris Saint-Germain, Bayern, Munich, the fact that we're discussing Formula One staging one of its events, this blessing that has been bestowed upon Rwanda, as though it is the way we would like all our African, development partners to be. I find it absolutely astonishing because alongside what it's doing in Congo, it's also got a terrible human rights record at home in terms of jailing the head of the opposition, not allowing the opposition leader to run in elections repeatedly, faking election results, killing journalists, and attempting to kill members or rivals, political rivals to Paul Kagame who fled abroad and who have been threatened here on British soil. I mean, this is another thing that tends to be ignored, which is that Rwanda has a really strong track record, one of the most shocking track records of any country for transnational repression. And we, back in 2011, the Metropolitan Police warned 4 Rwandan exiles on British soil that their lives were in danger from the Rwandan embassy. I think the Rwandan embassy here represents a real threat to the Rwandan community here. It is the current ambassador to Rwanda is someone who his accreditation could and should have been challenged when it was done. It was not. This did not happen because it coincided with the asylum deal, which was being discussed at the time. This is a man who is on the record as having organised the kidnapping of Rwandan hotelier Paul Rusesabagina, who could have been deported as part of the Magnitsky Accord Act, which Britain has signed up for. And we know that the embassy is a hub of monitoring, intimidation and harassment of the community here, and also harassment of people like me who stand up and give talks about Rwanda. We get targeted. So, one of the very obvious questions is maybe there should be a few consequences for the Rwandan embassy here.
I agree that we have misunderstood the nature of the Rwandan government, and that many Western, including British officials and politicians, have gone to Rwanda and seen that it appeared to function very well, and have, as a consequence, been unable to comprehend in some way that Rwanda might be an aggressive party in a major regional conflagration that's become a major regional war. I think there's what you might call cognitive dissonance that people find very difficult to manage. But I just, and some interests as well, but I'd just like to take a slightly different tack on your question, which is about mass atrocity violence. The best way to prevent mass atrocity violence, well, firstly, I'd just say that some of this prevention work has been going on in the Congo for 20 years and has been going on with some success. And I think that the absence of communal atrocity violence in the last 3 or 4 years that the M23 has invaded North Kivu is something to be welcome, and shows the success of this kind of grassroots community peace building, with a very strong role for the churches in the Congo, civil society in North Kivu, with backing from international partners, which I think is very important. But that would then, the important point to make as a follow-up to that is that the best way to prevent atrocity violence is to prevent war, because war lays the ground within which atrocity violence becomes imaginable and then necessary in the discourse that people who provoke atrocity violence use. So the most important thing to prevent atrocity violence is to prevent war, and we come back to the point that Rwanda is the initiator of this situation. So the way to prevent atrocity violence is to try to put pressure on Rwanda to pull back and to stop, at the very least, to stop any further escalation, at the very least.
And just coming onto minerals now. I mean, one of you said out eloquently earlier on, Richard, the kind of historical and ethnic and political drivers of this conflict. I think a lot of the coverage immediately reaches for minerals as a way to simplify that and to explain what's going on. How central do you think conflict minerals are to this conflict?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that in these circumstances, warring parties will fight for whatever is there, and that I don't think the existence of those minerals on their own explain a conflict. I mean, we see, for example, in the West African Sahel, armed groups fighting for long periods of time in areas which are extremely resource poor, and indeed, in some cases, armies of different countries crossing borders and so forth. So I don't think that conflict minerals explains it. I think conflict minerals, to some degree, and the money derived from them to some degree, fuels the extent of this violence, because it undoubtedly fuels armed groups and creates one of the incentives for intervention by the Rwandans. Historically, the Ugandans, Rwandans and Burundians have continuously intervened in eastern DR Congo to secure mineral routes. Now, the important point to make there, I think, is that happens in peacetime. And then the question becomes, do countries like Rwanda, but not limited to Rwanda, stand to gain more money by starting a war and taking over the mineral trade? Yeah. They do. It's not necessarily easy, it's contested, but I can certainly say from first-hand evidence I've gathered last year in Eastern DRC that since the M23 expanded significantly at the beginning of last year, evidence I gathered in 2024, but since the Rwandans and M23 expanded significantly at the beginning of that year and took over very significant mining areas, including the Rubaya mining area, the trade in minerals from that area is now directed entirely through M23 controlled areas into Rwanda, and that's before the recent expansion in the last few months. That stands for over a year. So that money is important. Rwanda is a poor, despite its in some ways shiny image as being a conference centre, it's got very significant structural financial issues and problems. It's exporting a very large quantity of valuable minerals that are clearly not being mined in Rwanda, and that's very clear. The question then, I think, becomes a somewhat difficult question about Kigali's calculations. I would judge that they anticipated most of the aid cuts that they've seen, or the potential aid cuts. As Michaela says, it's not entirely clear exactly how much will be cut, but they have anticipated that, and probably also, not probably, I would judge that they anticipated significant reputational damage from what they've done in the last 3 months. So the question then becomes, has Kigali calculated that it will make enough money with minerals to compensate for that, or have they calculated that with the mood of the time, there is a new world on its way and aid was going to drop anyway, and the idea of great power politics and countries throwing their weight around and taking territory is rather more in the atmosphere of the times, and they still have significant unproblematic allies in the Gulf who will take their minerals. I would have thought that that's in the thinking of the Rwandans' leadership.
Can I ask you about that? Because I think 25 years ago with the second war there, much of the conversation was about international indifference, whereas this time there seems to be a lot of, as you say, kind of great power politics going on. We have a critical minerals deal. The Trump administration are talking about it as well. Is there a risk that this starts to become sort of almost a proxy conflict as well, with some of those interests coming into play either directly through the international powers themselves, or you've mentioned the role of mercenaries coming in as well from other countries?
I think it's very interesting that the Tshisekedi government just recently has been attempting to put its mineral riches on the table to persuade Trump to provide some kind of security guarantees, basically doing a kind of echoing of the Zelensky-Trump conversation and the Zelensky-Trump deal. The thing is, it's hard to imagine the Americans getting invested seriously in Congolese security guarantees, given that their entire focus for the last a couple of decades has been keeping American soldiers away from Africa.
They may give permission through silence to people who are backing and have mineral interests on both sides of this conflict, to me just turn a blind eye because of that to things that should otherwise be challenging.
Well, yeah.
Well, I think the role of minerals in this geopolitical conflict is quite complex. First, I'd just point out that the
Can I, before you go any further, where are the minerals in DRC?
That was where I was going to start.
Okay.
So firstly, major industrial mining is in the former Katanga province, which is now split into 4 provinces, and that's really big scale, really important, and provides a lot of money for the Kinshasa government. Not enough. I mean, the deals that the Kinshasa government are not great.
I'm just trying to work out on the map where that is then.
Directly
in the
south of South.
Directly south.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Those minerals which are industrially mined are going almost exclusively to the Chinese. The Chinese have an enormous first mover advantage, and indeed Western companies, including American companies, have withdrawn over the past 3 years from their interests. There are some broadly Western interests, for example, in Glencore, but it's otherwise, and even Glencore are financing trade that would then go to China. So I think that there is.
The south of the capital is a big mining area, and that's what is that, cobalt or diamonds or?
Sorry.
You're talking about Shaba, are you? Katanga, yeah.
Yes, you were just saying. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were saying in the south that that is a big mining area, and I'm just asking what is it?
It's everything really, but
everything.
It's copper.
Traditionally.
What else is it?
Well, the most important mineral to be mined out of Katanga in value terms is copper by a large degree. It's got 7% of the world's copper production.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's very important. Okay. I mean, the other are critical minerals, but actually copper is used in greater volume in these industries, and that's the most important element of Kinshasa's of former Katanga's production. So the money
also
that
a purity issue around this, right? When it comes to the DRC's minerals, cobalt and copper, they have a purity that is unrivaled anywhere else in the world.
Yes,
that's their value.
Yes.
Okay.
So just to briefly continue, the money that Kinshasa is getting from those minerals is a factor here. It allows Kinshasa, however clumsily, to create international alliances, as we are seeing with Washington at the moment. It's not clear quite what the nature of that negotiation might be, given that American firms have largely decided to not go back in. The Americans have actually financed, along with partial funding by the European Union, what's called the Lobito Corridor, which is a train network to get minerals out of southern DRC through Angola and into shipping lanes, but that's not going to prevent those minerals going to China. So it's not very clear what might be negotiated. It may be that the Americans might come in and buy some probably quite small amount of critical minerals, but which they consider critical, in return for, well, it's really not clear in return for what, possibly in return for greater pressure on Rwanda. That would be Kinshasa's first ask, certainly. For broad diplomatic support, as Kinshasa seeks to push back on negotiations with the M23, that would also be a kind of ask of Kinshasa. But this, as you might imagine, it's very, very unclear who's speaking to who and what that kind of Washington-Kinshasa consists of at the moment.
Is there a viable military proxy for the US?
Well, that's difficult to answer. Kinshasa has tried allies and tried mercenaries, and they haven't worked. Is there a scenario where real equipment, and that would probably mean drones, could be really put into effective use by the Kinshasa government? Well, it's not impossible, but in the past, what has happened is that the equipment has come in, but the whole command, logistics and operational infrastructure within the Congolese armed forces isn't there, and therefore they're not able to make tactical and strategic use of that. But it couldn't be ruled out. Certainly Kinshasa has a lot of money, and throwing money at this problem is the attractive option for Kinshasa, so I can't rule that out.
Nice.
Can I drag you back to the mining, though? So unless I've missed it, so you talked about one area of mining. So I think I'm really just asking, are we talking about there being lots of mining in eastern DRC as well?
All through the Kivus. There's
Right.
one of the biggest coltan mines in the world at a place called Rubaya, which is now in M23 control, has been for a while.
What is it called?
Coltan. Which
In
is one of those strategic
okay.
minerals you need to make computers and mobile phones.
Right.
There's also a tin mine, which is actually now coming under pressure from M23, and we saw it produces, I think, 70% of the world's tin, and suddenly all production has halted there because M23 are approaching it. And there's a huge amount of gold mining that takes place in Kivu, and in a way people have become so obsessed with the whole story of your mobile phone was funded by blood money, they've forgotten that gold is actually one of the key ores that is being mined and being exported as Ugandan and Rwandan gold, but everyone knows that it's actually Congolese gold.
And just to fill in some from that, the tin mine has been closed down, which is very important if you're trading tin on the world market. Not that I am, but apparently that's very important. So broadly speaking, from Katanga, minerals are going out in broadly legitimate ways, often through Zambia, with at least some royalties being paid to Kinshasa. In the Kivus, Kinshasa's getting no royalties at all because it's all being shipped out via neighbouring countries without paying any tax, and from there a lot of the gold is being shipped to the Middle East, being flown to the Middle East, to use a more precise term, and then the coltan-related minerals, which breaks down into various critical minerals for electronic supplies, is presumably finding its way to Asian smelters, largely Chinese, but not exclusively.
And we haven't talked about diamonds, which of course are another big Congolese product, especially around the Kisangani area, I believe. And they're easier to smuggle and don't need to be processed in the same way, so they're a great gift to rebel movements around the world.
Just very quickly, so prior to this conflict, Global Witness had gone to the sort of training centre in Nzabira, and had found essentially that the labelling, international due diligence labelling of the 3 Ts was meaningless, that most of it was actually coming from militia-controlled mines rather than...
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of fakery going on, and Global
laundering.
Witness's report exposed that, and so have various authors. There's been a couple of books published recently by experts who sort of said it actually sort of backfired, the whole attempt to tag minerals, blood minerals.
Gave legitimacy to these minerals.
It hasn't done what was intended.
The two just very slightly separate issues. One is minerals which are mined within an area controlled by armed groups, which are often described as conflict minerals. There is another very important issue, which is simply smuggling minerals and not passing through the Congolese customs chain and therefore depriving the Congolese exchequer of money needed for the development of the country. So those are slightly different questions. Armed groups control large areas of eastern DRC and have done for many years, and that's where the conflict mineral issue comes from. The point that I think is important to retain over the last, in the current crisis since late 2021, is that before that time, it was quite contested. You had a number of Congolese trading houses in Goma who I've talked to last year, who had some, they were selling some coltan, some gold, and so forth. Legitimately, not to me to say whether they paid all their tax, but they had an office when they were there in a legitimate sense. But now, in North Kivu at least, that mining is now pretty much completely in the hands of the M23, meaning it's just being shipped out of Rwanda, and the Congolese are frozen out of the business.
So if you are Apple or Tesla or Samsung or all these companies who have sort of lent on this certification process, I mean, it feels like any certification process coming out of Eastern DRC at the moment is pretty meaningless.
Well, the Congolese government is suing Apple at the moment, so it clearly doesn't feel that it's helped Belgium, Congo sort out the legitimacy of that trade.
I mean, unless there is a record of legitimately paid customs dues, Rwanda and Uganda simply cannot export the quantities of minerals they're exporting without them having been smuggled from another country. Whether the areas in that country are subject to the control of armed groups or not, the fact is that they are smuggled minerals and they're not paying due tax.
I just ask quickly, just on a practical basis, if I were to go to a mine in a warlord-controlled area and then one in a government-controlled area, in terms of the experience of the workers in that mine, would I be able to tell the difference?
I have not investigated personally to that level of detail. I would suspect not very much, if at all. But I can't say that that's something I've kind of gone around and done myself.
I mean, what I heard was that sort of 15 years ago you would get mines in which, there's a lot of child labour and pretty appalling conditions, artisanal mines, and there would be a Rwandan soldier or a Ugandan soldier standing over the mine with a gun in his hand and then, making sure that he got the proceeds and funneled them back to his country. The scenario that was being painted to me more recently was that these were Congolese-run mines, and that whatever conditions were like in those mines, this scenario of sort of predatory pillaging, was no longer the same. What I don't know is how that is changing as we speak, because it's been 3 years now that the M23 have been controlling some areas where minerals are being extracted.
If I may, I would just add, sorry, I'm trying to react quite quickly to that, but if I could just add, the efforts that international actors, including the UK, has put in with Congolese authorities to try to do some of this are not possible if Congo doesn't control that territory. So any possibility of improvements becomes extremely difficult if you're looking at a rebel group that controls half of the country. In fact, and I come back to my point that what is at risk here in the current situation is 20 years of painstaking, difficult and expensive peace building in DR Congo, in fact.
Richard.
Thank you. We saw protests last month in Kinshasa outside some countries' embassies, I think the US, France and Belgium. Why were those countries targeted, and why haven't we seen any similar action outside the British embassy in Kinshasa? Do we know?
I think there's a particular level of fury towards France, because the Congolese are very aware that France, Emmanuel Macron is, got a good working relationship with Paul Kagame, and that a deal was signed whereby Rwandan troops went and deployed around the Total installation in Mozambique. So I think France is seen as being absolutely sort of in bed with the Rwandans. With the Americans, I think that was probably just knee-jerk anti-Westernism. I mean, what I've noticed, I was in Kinshasa in 2023, and what I was noticed, and I was sort of shocked by it, was there is a sort of rising contempt and anger and at the hypocrisy, the perceived hypocrisy at the West, and strangely and bizarrely that sort of manifests itself as pro-Russia sentiment. So I took part in a panel, and at one stage I said something rude about Putin, and the whole audience suddenly went, there was a perceptible murmur of disapproval, because although I think most of them realize that what Putin has done in Ukraine is almost identical to what Kagame is doing in Eastern Congo, there's still a sort of such a level of exasperation with the West that is perceived as being solidly pro-Rwandan for years and for decades, that anyone who is seen as being anti-Western has become very popular in Kinshasa, and especially on the streets. So I think the attacks on the embassies were just, there's a sort of level of Western, anti-Western feeling that, and I believe that Felix Tshisekedi said, occasionally in exasperation, does the West want me to turn to Russia? And there have been contacts between Russia and Kinshasa going on. So that there is a distinct animosity towards Western interests as expressed by the embassies. You also have to look at it in the context of Congo's history, where you had Patrice Lumumba, who was, the Cold War prime minister, who ended up being assassinated with the approval of the CIA, who was communist-leaning, and had been talking to Moscow, and who is widely seen in Kinshasa and Congo as having been murdered, with at the bidding of the CIA. So there's a history there of feeling that Congo has been manipulated and used, and that it is perennially a victim of Western cynicism and greed.
But why might the UK have escaped that sentiment so far, I wonder?
Yes, that's a good question. I don't know why.
I would, firstly, on that direct question, I just wouldn't read too much into that. I definitely agree with my colleague about the French, that the French have been very prominent in their support of Rwanda. They've also taken more direct diplomatic initiatives. They hold the pen in New York on UN Security Council resolutions on the Great Lakes, so they're generally more in the foreground in those terms. Macron has engaged in diplomacy. He met Tshisekedi. That didn't go particularly well. He tried to get them, Tshisekedi and Kagame, to meet at the Francophonie summit near Paris. That didn't go well. So France has kind of put itself a bit more to the fore, at least in that perception. If I could just add my opinion on what Michaela has just said, there are deep ties between Congo and the West, and many Congolese elite are quite Western in their outlook, and many have spent much of their youth in the West, and particularly in Belgium, and those ties include deep ties through the Catholic Church. But countering that and agreeing a bit more with Michaela, there is a very strong feeling of being either abandoned or exploited. There is the word balkanization is an absolutely recurrent word in Congolese popular politics, and the feeling that external powers are coming in to carve up our country is a kind of constant touchstone of Congolese politics. And Congolese politics, very much the opposite of Rwanda, is one that is deeply impacted and affected by the street, and by popular politics has a role, even if these demonstrations were at least partly politically manipulated by the Congolese government intending to put pressure on Western countries. They wouldn't have worked if they didn't represent a popular feeling of anger towards the West for either abandonment or, more sinisterly, plotting to balkanize their countries and steal their wealth.
It may boil down to a very simple fact that the British Embassy is located in a part of of the city, which is well away from the city centre. I know it well, and the Belgian embassy, the US embassy, the French embassy are much more centrally located. So if you're staging a sort of street protest, and if the government is giving sort of nudges and hints that it wouldn't object to a little bit of direct action, that's much more easy to organise in the centre of Kinshasa instead of the Gombe, which is quite a distance from the city centre.
When it comes to the exploitation of minerals, you used the word exploited a moment ago, Richard. There's no difference in feeling about UK policy as opposed to policy in the US, Belgium, France, with regard to minerals and exploitation.
The UK is not particularly associated with mineral exploitation. This is a bit beyond my competence, but I would suppose that the UK, having a strong role in world finance, is probably financing a number of these operations, but is not considered particularly prominent in the minerals trade. Rightly, I would just underline that the reality, to put aside Congolese perception, the reality is that the main industrial mining is going to China. Almost all of it. And then we're buying the Chinese products.
And then, if I might just ask, Michaela, you talked earlier on about Rwanda's support to regional peacekeeping in sub-Saharan Africa, and you talked about that Rwanda was even sort of considering new places that it might intervene to support regional conflict resolution. What does Rwanda get from its contribution to those peacekeeping missions?
It gets a lot of income, apart from anything else. Because it so often contributes to UN peacekeeping forces. The government gets it's an important stream of income. I think it's $150 million last year that Rwanda benefited from because of its peacekeeping contributions. There's been a series over the years. As I said, its troops have been active in Darfur. It had policemen who were in Mali. There were also Rwandan forces went to South Sudan. They are currently in Mozambique. They are currently very much present in Central African Republic. And what you've seen over the last few years, it's really noticeable if you read the Rwandan newspapers, is there's been a stream of West African leaders going to Kigali and spending long periods in closed doors having discussions with Paul Kagame. And, Western Africa at the moment is where you're seeing military coup after military coup, thanks to the impact of various Islamic jihadist rebel forces in West Africa. And so these Western African leaders are going to Kagame and saying, can we do a deal? Will you come up and prop up our governments, because we're in danger of being toppled. I was at a journalistic conference and heard from my colleagues that they are already present in Guinea and Benin, Rwandan forces, and often it won't be obvious that they're there because they've donned the local army uniform, but the sort of presidential guard is often made up of Rwandans and not local Beninois or Guinean troops.
And so how much has UK policy prioritised Rwanda as a bulwark against Islamism in Africa over other aspects of Rwandan?
I think that's been a huge factor, especially for the Americans. Right. And as you can see, the French did a very, very direct transactional deal: protect our Total installation, and we'll give you aid in return. The Rwandans got a very nice aid package as a result of that. And the EU apparently also accepted that argument, because you actually saw this extraordinary situation in which the EU were handing over, I think it was $40 million in repeated tranches to support the Rwandan deployment in Mozambique. And it's supposed to be non-military aid, but this is still aid that is going to the Rwandan army in Mozambique, just at a time when we know that the Rwandan army in Congo is supporting a rebel movement seizing, larger and larger tracts of land. And I think this is a sort of complete, sort of a total failure of joined-up thinking that, Rwanda's been benefiting from the supposed role as the policeman of Africa, but it's quite clearly a predator, a destabilizing force in its own backyard. And so we in the West have been happy to support the policeman in Africa role, but we haven't sort of done the joined-up thinking of saying, well, they're actually behaving like complete vandals in another part of Africa that matters very much to us.
And so is there any scope for squeezing that contribution of Rwandan peacekeepers to the region?
Well, I certainly think, I gather that the US has been placing under review the UN's tendency to revert to Rwanda as a go-to option for peacekeeping forces, for sure. But I think that's an area, for example, where the British government could also bring pressure to bear. I mean, lobbying work to be done. The EU also obviously needs to stop funding that Rwandan deployment in Mozambique. That's unconscionable, it seems to me. So I think, that's an area in which pressure can be applied for sure, because it is an important stream of income.
Thanks, Michaela. Richard, did you want to add something?
Please, yeah. So certainly the income stream is important. In terms of what Rwanda want from this, remembering that Rwanda is a military state, and that being able to deploy security forces outside their country is a kind of commodity that Rwanda has. It's something that it can offer, sell, but also offer for influence. It's part of a broader Rwandan strategy of influence across the African continent, which has been pretty effective and comes along with a lot of diplomacy. They're very influential in the African Union and in various other organisations which have a big footprint in Africa. And Michaela mentioned that they're present in Mozambique, Central African Republic. Many African leaders appreciate that. African leadership has a kind of ambivalent relationship with Kagame. I think they see his effectiveness, but they're rather cowed by him as well. So I think that's part of it. So it's part of a broader influence package. I think that the Rwandans are perfectly aware that their deployment in peacekeeping operations in other places gives them leverage over Western officials concerning what they do in DR Congo. And I think that they're aware of this, and the evidence, I think that generally, but there's a very good piece of evidence, which is that they put pressure on Western governments to bury a report that's commonly known as the mapping report into atrocities committed in DR Congo in the 1990s and early 2000s, with the threat of withdrawing their peacekeepers from the UN mission in Sudan. So they are very aware that this deployment gives them the political leverage. The conclusion that I think we should draw from that is that those involved in funding, organising and benefiting from peacekeeping in the African context have become over-dependent on the Rwandan government, and there is a cost to that over-dependence.
We're in danger of running over. We've got, if we were going to finish at 3, then we'd only have about 6 minutes, and we've got some quite important issues to get through. So if everybody agrees to it, would it be all right if we ran over until 10 past 3? Because we want to talk about the ODA budget and also about atrocities, and particularly crimes and violence against women and girls. So can I, if everybody's all right about that, can I move to Abdesam? I think you wanted to ask about ODA.
Yeah, it's just in relation to the ODA budget. So you referenced earlier the rural poverty programme in Rwanda and in Congo. So I think in light of US aid cuts and our own government reducing its aid budget as well, where do you think that the government should emphasise its support, particularly in relation to any peace building programmes or governance initiatives?
I would have thought, in my view, no areas should be off limits. Kagame's actions in Eastern Congo are creating huge floods of displaced people who can't farm their fields and who are living under tarpaulins. The M23 has disbanded all these refugee camps, and these people are now on the move. Some of them are 61,000 of them have ended up in Burundi. They're going to be living in more refugee camps, just different ones. They're going to be reliant on World Food Programme rations. They can't support themselves. They're liable to disease. So I find it strange that we're concerned about the rural poor in Rwanda, which within its own frontiers is a very stable place, but we don't seem to care as donors at all about the poor of Congo, whose lives have been made much worse. So for me, that area should not be off limits or exempted from future cuts. Yeah.
Well, we have invested a large amount of ODA money in Rwanda on the basis that it's a stable country and on the basis that it uses that money well. I think that we need to put that into a more realistic regional context and take into account its destabilising role in DR Congo. And I say that in the broader sense that I think we should have done that for a long time. And I very much agree with Michaela's point that lifting some people out of poverty in Rwanda, while laudable, should be put in a context of the destruction that this war is wreaking in North Kivu, and that the Rwandans are primarily responsible for it.
Do you think aid should have been withdrawn from Rwanda?
So I'd make 2 points about that. Firstly, I think that sanctions of that kind need to come with coherent messaging, and I think that that has been a stumbling block for Western countries. And I think that the messaging needs to be coherent, it needs to be shared, and it needs to be around, we understand that this is an international war that you have sparked off in the Congo. We understand that there could be catastrophic consequences to this. We are asking you to stop. We are suspending aid to your country until you stop, with a clear path out of that. In other words, if you do stop, we understand that, and we are prepared to, reinstate that aid. I mean, as I'm sure you know, the sanctions debate is often about, paths out and so forth. That seems to me a position that we should have taken some time ago and we should take now.
Sorry. Oh, okay. No, I mean, one point that I know they come often from different pots, but this whole M23 operation in Congo is going to end up costing the British government in terms of aid, because it is going to end up having to send humanitarian aid, of huge amounts of it. And we've seen that, that build up over the last 3 years, and these humanitarian bridges that were being funded by bilateral donors. So it comes at a cost. So it seems to me, you can make an argument for, instead of spending this money in Rwanda, let's funnel that money to what is going to be a hugely costly humanitarian program, funded, no doubt, by countries like the British government. But also, I wanted just to make one point about aid to Rwanda. Donor aid has shrunk across the world, bilateral donor aid, because everyone's feeling the pinch in these post-COVID high inflation times. The biggest donor to Rwanda is the World Bank and IMF. The World Bank has a $520 million program there back in 2023. And back in 2012, when there was a donor cutoff that had sort of really a massive impact on the ground, very quick impact, the World Bank was part of it. And I think, bilateral donors and the British government, amongst other Western governments, they need to look at what the World Bank is up to and make sure that these contradictions are pointed out, because the World Bank's donor funding for Rwanda it just makes bilateral aid programs look like chicken feed in comparison.
But given they're the largest funders, will it bother them that the UK perhaps might reduce its budget? I mean,
Well, that's why I think it's up to the British government to use its lobbying capacities with the World Bank.
Well, I think that just to say that there is a kind of a point that I've heard echoed in meetings with officials in various different capitals, which is why suspend aid to Rwanda? They wouldn't change what they do. And Rwanda are trying very hard to pass that message, by the way. They're trying very hard to get across the message that you can suspend aid, but it won't make any difference. Now, the hidden subtext of that message is don't suspend aid, because we won't change it anyway, so you might as well keep spending your aid, because that's what you want to do, right? I think that shows that the Rwandans know that they're quite vulnerable on this, their economy is not doing well, and that is part of it, that pressure could make a difference. I would just emphasise it as part of a package. We're looking broadly at two scenarios here, because I don't see sufficient pressure coming on Rwanda for them to withdraw in the very near future. We're looking at holding lines as where they are now and trying to negotiate some agreement here that is both national but also international to get us out of this mess, or we're looking at expansion of the M23 Rwandan positions. And then, as I described in earlier evidence, really all bets are off for this country. And I think that's a very serious situation. I think that we need to underline that seriousness. Once you've taken that position, it seems fairly clear to me that aid is there on the table, as withdrawal of aid is part of that. I think if you are taking this seriously as a package and as a set of messaging, it becomes fairly obvious to me that you don't want to give money to this government or indeed to programs which this government is backing, except in perhaps the very worst case scenarios. But there I'd join Michaela in saying the worst cases are on the Congolese side. No, that's very clear. That once you've got that messaging right, that seems quite obvious. It seems quite clear that we wouldn't give money if that's the messaging we're passing.
And can I just to add to this?
I'm conscious of time. Sam, do you mind if we just have one more question and then we've got to move on to another topic?
Yeah, just in relation to Russia and China, so they're the main exporters of the minerals there. Will they move into the space of development in Congo, or is that just a transactional relationship in relation to minerals?
Well, famously, China is a transactional partner. I've not seen any sign of that. Have you?
Well, China, they give money, but they give it in a way that makes this direct impact and gets a direct political support. They support the governments in place, and then they trade and they talk about win-win, and they ship all the minerals back to China. And
very little development.
Well, it depends in a way how you define development. I think if you were in Beijing, you'd say this trade is what development should be about. So,
it also has to be said they had a massive program with Congo several years back. A sort of 10 billion deal was signed with the Congolese government to develop Congo's infrastructure. Some of that program was delivered, but most of it was not. So we have been down this route before with China offering Congo huge amounts of infrastructural investment, not all of which, most of which did not.
Yeah, it's a kind of another issue, but essentially the Chinese have got deals on Congolese minerals in the Katanga region, which are not very favourable to Kinshasa, and they essentially involve the Chinese undertaking to build infrastructure if the price of copper hits a certain ceiling, and the volume of copper being shipped out hits a certain ceiling, and in fact not very much of that infrastructure has been forthcoming.
And the UAE?
Well, the UAE obviously is not pulling out tons of minerals at an industrial level, but is certainly receiving a huge amount of gold, both illicitly smuggled out, but also there have been, in the not too recent past, but nevertheless, an attempt by Kinshasa to strike deals with the UAE to get a legitimate minerals trade together, but that has fallen apart in the light of recent events.
There are really very shocking and deeply disturbing reports of gender-based and sexual violence in the region. reports of women being raped and burned alive. Michaela, I don't know what your understanding is of what's happening out there, but also, do you have a view on why there just isn't getting the publicity and media coverage for the atrocities that are happening?
Yeah, this was a sort of favourite subject, really, for journalists about 10, 15 years ago, and you were often seeing reports of Goma being the rape capital of the world, or the DRC being the rape capital of the world. It all got fairly lubricious. And it's worth remembering that Bukavu, which is now in the control of the M23, is where there is a hospital run by the Nobel Peace Prize winner Denis Mukwege, who specialises in
Pansy
the Pansy Hospital. It specialises in dealing with women and trying to mend women who've been gang raped. I think it's worth pointing out, some of the nastiness that we saw in Goma. We saw a prison break, in which it was then discovered that the prisoners breaking out of the prison had taken the time to rape the women prisoners and then set fire to the area in which they were kept, and horrific stories. And we've also seen reports of I think it was like 895 rapes in the last 2 weeks of February, which averages out to 60 rapes a day. It seems to me that firstly you have a rebel movement, the M23, which was being accused of mass rapes and massacres, years ago in the area it was seizing control of. So it's now presenting itself to the world as like, we have cleaned up Goma, we're retraining the police in Bukavu. Kigali has been arranging for favourite journalists or analysts, or in one case a Belgian senator, to be flown to Goma and then do videos showing how peaceful it is, or how marvellous, and so they're trying to present themselves as a sort of reliable, operation that can install law and order. But well before they seized power, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had both published stories, and so had lots of journalists, about rape and massacres in the areas they'd seized. I think, sadly, rape is what happens, gender-based violence is what happens when you force people out of the areas they live in. Often men are either recruited to militias, or they run for their lives, or they're killed. Women are on their own. They're suddenly living in tents. They have to walk for miles to get water or wood. They are deeply, deeply vulnerable, and it becomes inevitable that there's a very steep rise in this kind of violence. So, yeah, I think we can expect more of it, sadly.
And I guess what more can the UK be doing? I mean, DRC is one of the worst places to be born a woman. I think over half of women in DRC will be subject to some kind of violence. I understand that we have been funding some healthcare and hospitals. Is that working, for example?
I don't know the details of those. Firstly, you need to find out where these people have gone. 800,000 people have disappeared because these camps were broken up by the N23, and we don't know where these people have ended up. They're on the move, which means they're very, very vulnerable. So the first thing will be to find out where they are. Then I imagine, some of them will be going back to their villages and will presumably try to resettle, but others will end up forming new camps, and that's when you will need those kind of clinics. The irony of all this, of course, is that Rwanda is famed for being pro-women, and you often see people who go to Kigali and they talk about, isn't it marvellous how many women are in the Rwandan parliament. So you have these extraordinary, horrible stories about violence against women in Congo, which is in part, thanks to Rwanda's involvement in the area, and yet then you have a country that sells itself, amongst other things, as a bastion of feminist empowerment.
I would just say that the populations of Eastern DR Congo are historically traumatized by violence, and I think that is one of the explanatory factors for the rates of gender-based violence. They have faced waves of predatory armed groups. Historically, there's a wide responsibility for that, but neighbouring countries, including Rwanda, over the past 30 years, have some responsibility for that. They don't alone. So do many Congolese nationals, armed groups, armed forces, police. and so forth. So the responsibility for that is widely shared. In order to tackle that kind of situation is a long-term, hard, painstaking work of community reconciliation, education, healthcare, women empowerment, and so forth, which the UK has supported and other donors have supported. If you have a war situation, firstly, all the vulnerabilities of women and children rise immediately, as Michaela was saying, displacement being the first one, and therefore you see a rise in gender-based violence. Secondly, the current situation means that engaging with national and provincial Congolese authorities and others to try to push forward those kind of peace building, those kind of gender-based violence aspects of peace building becomes difficult and even impossible. So I would emphasise that although it seems very bleak, we should not give up hope that progress can be made with peace in these issues.
Blair, I think you had a last question you wanted to ask.
I think I asked it earlier on.
Yes.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
good. Well, look, thank you so much for coming in. It's been very instructive. It's been horrible to hear the details of some of this, but it's very instructive for us, and we greatly appreciate it. And I hope that you found it a good opportunity to be able to explain this. We have certainly benefited hugely from having these matters explained to us in the way that we have. So our gratitude is to you, and I'll call this hearing to an end. Order.